Questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition will add a couple of seconds at the end of the clock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's for the Premier. We were all shocked at the recent news that there had been a spike in abuse at Nova Scotia's long-term care facilities. 42 cases actually were reported in 2017. That's nearly doubled the average from the previous 2 years. These involve cases of neglect, physical abuse, emotional, and even sexual abuse. Some cases were between residents, some between staff, and some between other residents with residents. So, Mr. Speaker, this is an all too familiar pattern for our healthcare system, and I'd like to know, how does the Premier expect Nova Scotians to trust that their parents and their grandparents and siblings are safe in long-term care in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank all of those across our province who are providing care, long-term care facilities from one end of Nova Scotia to the other. The report the honourable member is referring to, I read that report. I have asked the Department of Health for some information related to some parts of that report that the honourable member referred to. I think it's also for us to recognize that we have some of our loved ones are in long-term care facilities that have illnesses that are causing them to react differently than they ordinarily would, Mr. Speaker, and as we try to put supports around them, and as part of what this committee will do is look at how do we continue to make sure that we provide the appropriate care for our loved ones, at the same time ensuring that the safety of those in those facilities is paramount.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it was a struggle for the CBC to sift through the records they obtained from the FOIPOP officer for any usable information, and I will table that story by CBC. According to the article, descriptions of many of the reports are grayed out, and most of the directives given to the facilities are redacted. So government is obviously reluctant to give the details, and which manipulates the FOIPOP system. This is obviously a disgraceful pattern for government secrecy that continues, obviously at the expense of taxpayers. So what directives have been given to long-term care facilities, and what does the government want, and why do they want to keep it such a secret?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable for the question. Her original question recognized, Mr. Speaker, that the FOIPOP officer had received information that led to the belief that the actual incidents are on the rise, Mr. Speaker. There's no way government is trying to hide from this. This is a very serious issue. There was a number of suggestions inside of that report that are concerning, Mr. Speaker. We need to continue to make sure that we work with those who are providing care in our long-term care facilities. It's why we've actually gone out and put together an expert panel to look at how do we best ensure that we deal with the issues that the honourable member is referring to today, the issues of bed sores that we've heard about, that are not new phenomena, Mr. Speaker, but we need to deal with them, the seriousness of these, and we need to make sure that as we continue to live longer, as we continue to have illnesses that are causing some of us to act differently than we normally would, Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that we have the right kind of environment and services to provide them.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, these are new cases that I'm speaking about that just came out in a story as of yesterday. So there's not just one thing that is wrong in this system. Some facilities don't have enough staff. Some facilities have enough staff, but they're not properly trained. Some people say reports are filed. Some people say reports are never received. The left hand, Mr. Speaker, doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and the right hand thinks the left hand is afoot. This is all too familiar pattern for this government's inability to manage complex problems. We're all suffering, Mr. Speaker, through this Premier's fix for health care. I'd like to know, Mr. Speaker, what his fix is particularly for long-term health care in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think, Mr. Speaker, it's important to recognize that almost all residents in long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker, having the experience and treatment that we believe and know they deserve, Mr. Speaker, the same kind of level of service that we want to ensure that every resident in our long-term care facilities have. It's their home. And all of us want to ensure that we have the safety of our surrounding and our environments in our homes. We do know, though, Mr. Speaker, there have been incidents, not just in the last number of years, but over periods of time, where, Mr. Speaker, the safety of some people in our residence has been put in jeopardy. And the honourable member is referring to reports that have been brought out. I said that's one of the things that we're having this expert panel look at to bring us back recommendations. I've said we want to have specific recommendations where we can make the investments and continue to improve the long-term care that we offer to our residents.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Throughout this session of the House, the Premier has repeatedly trumpeted Standard & Poor's recent revision of the province's credit rating. And it's important, as everybody recognizes a positive credit rating for the province is, it's also true that this trumpeting rings hollow to a lot of people in the province. Amongst them would be those single people who must rely on income assistance and whom the government is forcing to live at the moment on $810 a month, the second lowest assistance level anywhere in the country. I submit that as long as this remains the case, bond rating agency or no bond rating agency, the government's economic work remains a failure. And I want to ask the Premier, will he acknowledge that this is a fair and a reasonable assessment?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member recognizing the Standard & Poor's has recognized the great work of our province, Mr. Speaker, and all Nova Scotians to continue to improve the financial outlook of our province. But, Mr. Speaker, it is not just simply to get to an end to means, Mr. Speaker, by balancing your budget. There's a reason for that. Today, I celebrated public servants who are dealing with the issue of program of opportunities for Nova Scotians. Over 650 young Nova Scotians have a job because of that investment we made into that particular program, Mr. Speaker. Today, Mr. Speaker, I recognize the Department of Immigration, Mr. Speaker, who's hitting every target to increase our population, which is providing new economic opportunities. This past weekend, I celebrated with the Lebanese community, Mr. Speaker, who are not only building this city, Mr. Speaker, but they're hiring our sons and daughters and providing more job opportunities, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, I want to tell the honourable member, when we had an opportunity, the single largest tax cut in the history of our province was directly to the very people he's referring to. We know there's more work to do. We're going to continue to make sure we have the right balance sheet to make those investments.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
And under the heading of those for whom the credit rating news rings hollow when we hear it trumpeted in this kind of way are those who are working in the province for minimum wage. Here's a fact that Standard & Poor's doesn't mention, that 40% of the people who live below the poverty line in Nova Scotia have a full-time, all-year-round job and often are unable to buy their groceries because their job doesn't pay them enough to do so. And the reason for that is that we are going to have in 1 week the lowest minimum wage in the entire country. So I want to ask the Premier, does he not feel some sense of, at this point, having fallen short, just shy now of the 6th year of his government being in power, when we're in a situation where the lowest paid people in our province are the lowest paid in the entire country?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable for the question. As again, my first answer, I said the single largest tax cut in the history of our province is directed, Mr. Speaker, directed towards those Nova Scotians that he's referring to. Mr. Speaker, one of the mistakes, though, I will say, and we're going to continue to look for ways, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we improve the lives of all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, we're also, when it comes to the minimum wage, following what the program that was put in place by the Democratic Party, he's probably right, Mr. Speaker. It probably was a mistake, and I should review it.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Others who remain unuplifted by the various pieces of financial information the Premier is bringing forward are the people who took out last year the 200,000 payday loans that were lent in our province, and the 4,000 people in our province who declared personal bankruptcy. So I want to ask, does the Premier not find it a bit unseemly or a bit unfitting to speak in these self-congratulatory and boastful times at a time in the midst of a time when so many people in our province are experiencing such intense financial problems?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, more Nova Scotians are working today than ever before, Mr. Speaker, in full-time jobs. Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, we're seeing startups increasing in our province, improving, Mr. Speaker, job opportunities for young Nova Scotians. We're seeing the construction boom, not only in this city, but in our highways across the province that are hiring Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing young people, Mr. Speaker, who see a future for themselves, attaching them to workplace in this province. Mr. Speaker, we're leading the country when it comes to economic outlook. Every other major financial institution is wrecking the good work that our province is doing, the good work that Nova Scotians are doing, and we're going to continue to make sure that we provide economic opportunities for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we're still trying to get to the bottom of the use of private email by the former Minister of Health. The FOIPOP Commissioner has asked for the Department of Health to produce certain emails to and from the former Minister of Health. It's a simple request. Just turn over the emails. There has been no indication that the Department of Health has even searched for these emails. I asked the Premier last week, but I'll ask the Minister of Health now. Can he confirm that the emails still exist, or have they been deleted?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that the department did undertake a search to identify emails, provided a body of email material as requested by the applicant. That information was provided, went out from the department. That search was undertaken on systems that were under the care and control of the department. That information was provided as part of that request.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
So the request was to share the emails. So the FOIPOP Commissioner was clear in her report. That's what the request was. The department ought to have care and control of those emails, and basic record-keeping practices should allow the department to find these emails quickly unless they have failed in these basic record-keeping practices. No one needs to get pulled off doctor recruitment to fulfill the Commissioner's request. So if the minister has the emails, will the minister produce them? And if he does not, will he explain how his department has failed to maintain simple record-keeping practices?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned previously, the department did receive a request through the FOIPOP process. The request was amended. The information was searched based upon that amended request, and that information was provided back to the applicant, Mr. Speaker. That work was done, and that information was provided.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
I would like to return to the question of the nursing home revelations we received today that my colleague brought up earlier. Striking originally in that it refers to a level in 2017 almost as great as putting 15 and 16 together for reports of abuse, but striking also in that a number of those incident reports contain references to an element in the incident of a shortage of staff or of an inadequate staff-to-resident ratio in the context in which that incident happened. Now, it's pretty well 4 years since the government began its program of cuts in nursing home funding, and in that time, administrators, employees, families, residents have all spoken about how the impact of those cuts has impacted staffing levels around the province. And so will the Premier acknowledge that with this report today, there is now more mounting evidence that his government has failed to uphold an appropriate standard of care in our nursing homes?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Honourable for the question. As you know, as I've said, that we've appointed an expert panel, Mr. Speaker, to go look at long-term care facilities. We await for the recommendations that they will bring in to us, Mr. Speaker. I think it's sometime around the end of November. That timeline is to look at through the budget process to make those investments. Our hope is that we'll get specific recommendations from this committee.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
But think about the time that passed before the panel was appointed. Month after month, season after season, year in and year out, we questioned the Premier about emerging reported problems in nursing homes. And throughout all that time, we were dismissed and brushed aside with answers about the government's investments and policies about home care. Now, after all of that time, earlier this month, the evidence somehow seems to have finally broken through, and we do have the announcement of the panel, and we are in our party hopeful about the work and recommendations of the panel, but we remain dismayed about all the time, all the years that have passed before any substantive changes in staffing levels are going to be made. So I want to ask the Premier, is he not concerned that his change of heart now has come too late in the day for many who would have benefited over the past number of years by staffing increases?
Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable for the question, and I want to tell him, Mr. Speaker, they're hardworking Nova Scotians across our province providing quality care to our loved ones in nursing homes from one end of this province to the other, Mr. Speaker. There has always been challenges, Mr. Speaker. They didn't resurface 5 years ago, Mr. Speaker. There were challenges when they were in government. There was challenges when they were in government. We continue to work to ensure that we provide the care as required. You referred to home care, Mr. Speaker. It's an important component. We're hearing from Nova Scotians who tell us they want to be in their home as long as possible. We need to provide them the supports, and that's what we're doing. At the same time, we'll wait for the report to come back from the expert panel about long-term care.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's been a custom of this House that the Public Accounts Committee meet weekly for 10 months out of the year. The Public Accounts Committee has not meant to question departmental officials in an open public meeting since June 6th. Due to the procedural manoeuvring by the government members of the committee, October 10th is realistically the next time PAC will see an actual department witness. That's 4 months and at least 8 traditional meeting dates that will have been wasted. Can the Premier explain why the Public Accounts Committee has gone a third of a year without any departmental witnesses showing up?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member would know, Mr. Speaker, it has been also the tradition of this House that when June arrives, Mr. Speaker, there are no witnesses through the months that he's referring to. The reality of it is this House was prorogued. We had throne speech. Committees are being reconstituted. As you know, we answered the request about having a health policy committee. I look forward to public accounts committees when they come out. Also remind this House, when you look across the country, we sit more than any other Canadian jurisdiction by twice as much.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much. You know, the Premier knows full well that the committee stopped a few weeks short of their normal length. But you know what? It is Right to Know Week. It's an opportunity to raise awareness of individuals' right to access government information while promoting freedom of information as essential to both democracy and good governance. And the Public Accounts Committee is a vital means for members of this House to examine the affairs of government. It's a key pillar in transparency and accountability. And I understand it meets more frequently than the Premier would like, but at that, it's always been the nature of our committee. Can the Premier tell us why is he avoiding accountability by not allowing departmental officials to appear before PAC?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank Honourable for the question, but I do want to correct him, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is it did not stop meeting any earlier than it had in the past, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is he can go check the dates if he likes, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is that's simply not true. The reality is we don't sit through the summer months. Now those members who sit on the committee, Mr. Speaker, will put their work together. The Premier doesn't run the committee that he's referring to. Mr. Speaker, I'm out selling this province, Mr. Speaker. Why more young people are working here? It's why we're getting great standards already. Why our exports are up, Mr. Speaker. Why more young people are seeing a future in this province, Mr. Speaker. Why we're seeing more international students want to come, live and work and play here and grow our economy, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. That's my job, and I'm going to continue to do it, Mr. Speaker, because you want to know why? We're having great success.
The Honourable Member for Northside, Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, my office received a call from a woman crying out for help because of lack of response she is receiving from the healthcare system. This woman struggles daily with depression and has been at times suicidal. Since relocating to Truro, she no longer is able to see her psychologist in Yarmouth twice a month. She believed that she is not receiving equal access because of where she lives in the province as in Truro. So my question to the Minister, does he feel there's equal access to provision of services for all Nova Scotians suffering from poor mental health, and will he commit to follow up with this individual?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's without getting into details of specific individuals, as the member, I believe, would know as Minister, I'm not able to do. I believe the member did have conversations with other representatives of the legislature from 2 different parties that did advise that there's been a lot of work and support being provided to the individual that he's referenced, that there is supports available. The member would know, including a crisis line for individuals if they are in a period of crisis. We have been investing heavily, as the member would know, and all members of this legislature, in improving mental health care access. Mr. Speaker, will continue to take those steps and encourage the member, if he has the individual case, we can get him in touch with the appropriate people to provide the care that's needed.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a shame that Nova Scotians requesting help in their time of need are considered noise to this government. It's also a shame, and some people would even call it pathetic, the responses we are receiving from this minister that are no way close to the questions we are asking. Last week, I asked the minister to attend a rally in Cape Breton. This past week or so, he couldn't listen, so he could listen to hundreds of in attendance, but there was just no show again. The minister wouldn't answer to me a simple question of yes or no, but he told the Cape Breton Post that he had a scheduling conflict. No, table that article, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the minister is, if he couldn't attend because of a scheduling conflict, why didn't he simply just answer our question last week when we asked and explain to us the reason why?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite, raises some concerns. As the member, I think, in his first question demonstrated, we do work. I think, as all members of this legislature, on behalf of our constituents, we work, Mr. Speaker, with the government officials, the healthcare partners, to help navigate that system when our constituents aren't sure where to turn, Mr. Speaker. And again, the member opposite bringing concerns to the floor when he knows full well, Mr. Speaker, that not just the system but other MLAs within this legislature, within the community, are reaching out, are trying to provide that support to individuals. I think it's that kind of approach, Mr. Speaker, that's the challenge, and in the approach that member's trying to bring when we're working to improve the healthcare system, and all he's trying to do is find fault and not recognize the important investments that we've been making, Mr. Speaker, in our healthcare system across the province.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In early August, government sent out an RFP to review emergency health services in our province. Nova Scotians see ambulances lined up at hospitals and worry won't be available if and when they need it. The time for interested companies to submit a bid on the review has passed. So my question to the Minister of Health, will the Minister update the House on how much the EHS review will cost and when it will be complete?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, the RFP did go out. The work is ongoing. The work that the member knows, we have a keen interest in improving our EHS system, including offload times, where there were a number of questions brought up last week. I've mentioned the efforts that are ongoing to make those improvements. I've met and had conversations with both union representatives of our paramedics as well as paramedics on the front line. Mr. Speaker, I've taken the information they've provided to heart, and we are working to improve the system, and that's what part of that RFP is all about.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, the problems are not entirely EHS issues. It's an issue of the assembly line of healthcare. There are other issues that, if addressed, would reduce the problems with EHS waiting at hospitals. ER departments are the canary in the coal mine of the healthcare system. Problems there indicate problems throughout the entire system. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister admit that any EHS redesign, no matter how good, is doomed to fail if he doesn't recognize and fix the many other issues in the healthcare system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I believe, as I alluded to in my first response, as I mentioned several times last week in response to questions about ambulance offload times, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is we do recognize that our healthcare system is integrated. We rely on a wide variety of healthcare professionals in a wide variety of roles to provide the care that Nova Scotians need. Mr. Speaker, an example that I used, which was a change, Mr. Speaker, Speaker, that incorporated changes within our hospital environment, emergency department, making use of the skill sets of nurses as well as paramedics, Mr. Speaker, that help support and improve the offload times at a Dartmouth General Hospital. Work is underway, Mr. Speaker, to understand exactly how well those impacts have been and how we can roll it out in other parts of our hospital systems.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. This weekend, people gathered at the Cape Breton County Exhibition Grounds to raise their concerns about the closures of community hospitals in the CBRM. Unfortunately, the Minister was unable to attend. I wonder, would he have rearranged his schedule had he known that more than 400 concerned citizens would show up looking for someone they could hold accountable for this decision? Mr. Speaker, what is the Minister's excuse for ignoring the citizens of Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we're doing from a healthcare perspective in the Cape Breton region is well known. Mr. Speaker, we are investing in that region. We are revitalizing the infrastructure for our healthcare system in New Waterford and North Sydney, Mr. Speaker, providing new primary healthcare facilities where citizens will receive primary healthcare services. They'll continue to receive blood services, Mr. Speaker, x-rays and other healthcare services in those facilities. We're nearly doubling our long-term care access in those communities, Mr. Speaker. We're expanding our emergency room and doubling the size of our cancer care centre at Cape Breton Regional, Mr. Speaker, and expanding services in Glace Bay as well.
The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
So, Mr. Speaker, I categorically disagree with the member's suggestion that we're ignoring Cape Bretoners. In fact, we're investing in healthcare for Cape Bretoners.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I applaud the minister's response because if you categorically disagree, then you should probably watch, or the minister should watch the video where doctors describe at the meeting in North Sydney just how they were not informed or included in the decisions and they completely disagree with you. Mr. Speaker, this past weekend, emergency rooms in New Waterford and North Sydney were closed again. Residents are frustrated and for good reason. They've been asking for answers and they're getting silence. We are not getting new beds. We are not getting one new bed in the emergency room in the Cape Breton Regional Hospital, and we all know that. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask once again, with the Minister having enough notice to free your schedule, will you come to New Waterford to consult with the residents on the closure of their hospital on October the 14th and actually listen to their concerns?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, as the member would know, and we've been very clear since we made the announcement in June that, in fact, the next phase, which is underway of this revitalization process, is to do the functional plan. Based on the member's comments, I'm not sure if she's received a copy of that plan, because I certainly haven't, Mr. Speaker, for her to make accusations and conclusions that simply haven't been there. The suggestions around expanding emergency.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre will come to order. The Honourable Minister of Health.
That would be, Mr. Speaker, her conclusion that there would be no changes or expansion in the emergency departments, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what the functional planning process is all about.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre will excuse herself for the balance of question period. The Honourable Minister of Health.
That's exactly what the functional planning process is about, Mr. Speaker. That work is underway. That's where consultation is taking place, Mr. Speaker, to understand the impacts and the opportunities to properly design these facilities in New Waterford, North Sydney, as well as Cape Breton and Glace Bay to improve the future of healthcare for all Cape Bretoners.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. As everybody is now well aware, the Cole Harbour Eastern Passage constituency that I represent does not have a single family doctor, and we're one of the few that does not have funding for a collaborative health centre. Those fortunate to have a family doctor are terrified that their doctor is going to leave the province or retire, particularly as our doctors are the lowest paid in Canada. In order to address this issue, many physicians are looking to change their fee structure from the fee-for-service model to the alternative payment plan. Can the Minister detail for the House how many physicians have successfully switched to the alternative payment plan and how many are currently in the process of switching? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. I think one of the things that she forgot to reference was the progress being made to provide nurse practitioner in her community, to provide that care for her community that hadn't been there in many, many years. But, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the current numbers of physician breakdown based upon their compensation model, I don't have that in detail at my fingertips, but I could certainly reach out to staff and get that information back to the member.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer, and I do applaud him for giving me the funding for a clinical nurse practitioner, but I've been dragging the process along for the last 14 months, and we still don't have one yet, so I'm going to encourage the minister to help speed that along. I recently learned that 4 physicians, including my own family doctor from the Alberta Lake Medical Clinic in Dartmouth, have been waiting for over 5 months to find out if their application to move from fee-for-service to the alternative payment plan has been accepted. As we struggle to attract new doctors, we cannot afford to frustrate the physicians we already have. These critical health professionals are being stalled for months on end for an answer to their funding change application. My question to the Minister of Health is, what is an acceptable turnaround time for a physician to change from fee-for-service to the alternative payment plan?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think one of the important things to recognize when it comes to discussing the different models of compensation that are available for physicians in the province is not just the traditional 2 models known as the fee-for-service, which would be your historical traditional model, and the alternative payment APP, or some people refer to as a salaried approach, Mr. Speaker, but in fact a new 3rd model, which Doctors Nova Scotia has certainly been advocating for, which is the notion of a blended capitation approach of model. So there's a lot of work ongoing, Mr. Speaker, engaged with the association representing physicians across the province. We know we're going into negotiation, so there's a lot of work ongoing around what the best model is to ensure, as the member's concern was highlighted and duly noted, that we have the right model to make this an attractive place for all physicians to work.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Mr. Speaker, my question's for the Minister of Health. Last week I stood here and asked the Minister about the closures at All Saints Hospital in South Cumberland. As I stated last week, All Saints was closed 202 hours since August 1st, and South Cumberland Community Care Centre, ER, closed for 252 hours since July 29th. That's more than a quarter of the time for All Saints and more than a third of the time for South Cumberland. Now we have learned that this week, ER at All Saints will be closed all but 12 hours this week. My question to the Minister, are the regular closures of the ER hospital good groundwork for eventually closing All Saints Hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member may know, the preceding circumstances that result in the Nova Scotia Health Authority advising of closures of emergency departments in communities, and the examples cited by the member is a last resort, Mr. Speaker. That occurs after they've exhausted their efforts to find staff for vacancies that may be temporary vacancies for vacations or other absentees within the system. Mr. Speaker, we've taken steps as a government to improve the locum funding opportunities, to encourage physicians to be available. We continue our recruitment efforts. NSHA has hired additional recruitment staff in the Northern Zone to help improve the situation for communities like the members.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do recognize that the locum program, and they are trying to make it work, but quite frankly, it's just not working for these 2 hospitals. The closure at Northside and New Waterford Consolidated sent shockwaves throughout this province. Everyone is sensitive to this pattern, and people believe if their hospital is not a regional hospital, their days are numbered. Again, I will ask today to the Minister, as long as he is Minister of Health, will he commit to me for Cumberland South that Spring Hill Hospital at All Saints and South Cumberland and Parisbro will remain open?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I've committed to the member and his colleagues and all members of this legislature in the past, Mr. Speaker, my commitment to this legislature, and indeed to all Nova Scotians, is to fulfill my mandate to the best of my abilities. That's the oath I took, Mr. Speaker, as a member and as a minister, and I will continue to do that and fulfill my obligations. And that means, Mr. Speaker, to make the best decisions possible to ensure that we provide the best care possible to all Nova Scotians. We'll continue to do that, and we do that, Mr. Speaker, by hearing from our frontline professionals, our healthcare professionals, to provide input and advice on the policies that we need to adopt to move forward. And we continue to make those changes, as the member acknowledged, around recruitment and locum programs. We'll continue to do that to provide the care Nova Scotians need and deserve.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. The delivery of home care services in Nova Scotia is in crisis and needs a new funding model to properly address the current shortfalls service providers are facing. In order to deliver services, agencies must often overspend due to travel time and cancel visits. Some agencies must repay the government for the over-expenditure, but not all do. Staff are stressed because there's constant pressure to reduce travel time, which is nearly impossible given fluctuating client demand and, in many cases, geography. The government talks a big game on home care, yet providers still lack adequate funding, creating systemic stress amongst agencies and workers. My question to the Minister, when will the funding model be changed to adequately fund this essential service?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been investing heavily in home care services throughout the province, Mr. Speaker. This has been something we committed to. It's something that we've taken action on, Mr. Speaker. I believe the investment increased investment has been something in the vicinity of over $65 million, Mr. Speaker, targeted towards home care services and expansion. The results of that, Mr. Speaker, are clear in many parts of the province. We've virtually eliminated wait times for people to get access to home care. Mr. Speaker, we've seen lots of improvements throughout the province as a result of these investments.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, many home care service providers are experiencing staff recruitment and retention issues across the province. With the fluctuation of caseloads, few employees in home care have a guaranteed income. Because of staffing issues, hospital stays are prolonged because care cannot be put in place in the home. Wait lists for those who require care grow, and in some cases, a missed visit can occur causing undue stress to those in need. So my question to the Minister, what is government's plan to recruit and retain home care workers?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The work that we have committed to around home care continues. We recognize that the care of many Nova Scotians and their preference in many instances is to stay at home as long as possible. We recognize that in order to do that, they do require the appropriate cares and supports. That's why we've made significant investments, I believe over $65 million in the last number of years of increased investments towards our home care services, Mr. Speaker. That's what we've been doing in an effort to address wait lists and ensure that the care that people need in their homes is available when they need it.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Health. Over the past few weeks, we've heard terrible examples of the service gaps for people who have experienced sexual violence, including 2 totally unacceptable cases of women in the Truro region, one of whom left the hospital with only a pamphlet and the other who left the RCMP empty-handed. I have voiced my concerns several times, and both the Central Nova Women's Resource Centre and Colchester Sexual Assault Centre have also voiced their concerns about this lack of essential health service in our Central Nova region. So, in fact, they've sent 2 letters to the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the Minister of Health. So my question for the Minister is this. Can the Minister confirm today when the sexual assault nurse examiner program will be available in Truro?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the member raising this important question. I know, Mr. Speaker, this, while it is on behalf of constituents and concern for all Nova Scotians, I think members of the House know specifically how personal this question is for the member. Mr. Speaker, I don't have the exact dates lined up, but I can assure the member that work is ongoing. We're looking at a couple of different proposals for addressing and getting set up. I've met with representatives of a women's organization that provides sane services to learn about their proposal. I've met with representatives from both the department as well as the Nova Scotia Health Authority to discuss, and they are working on bringing those detailed proposals on a path forward to get this implemented, both short and long-term solutions.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that response. You know, the SANE programs are currently operating in Halifax, Dartmouth, Lower Sackville, Antigonish, New Glasgow, the Port Hawkesbury area, Yarmouth, and the government has also recently announced additional sites in Cape Breton and Annapolis Valley and the South Shore. That's wonderful for you people, but we don't have one in central Colchester, and it's a big problem. So, Mr. Speaker, the Colchester Sexual Assault Centre has collaborated with the Antigonish Women's Resource Centre and SANE personnel to establish a viable proposal to address the lack of essential service in our region. But they do need government support to put their plans into action. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit today to provide the Colchester Sexual Assault Centre with the funding needed to provide these essential services in our area?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Indeed, the Women's Resource Centre that I'd met with, the member referenced there, I met with the Antigonish Women's Resource Centre about 2 weeks ago, received that proposal. My colleague, the member for Colchester North, met with both the Colchester Women's Resource Centre as well as the Antigonish Women's Resource Centre, I believe about a week ago. She also received that proposal and brought it to my attention. As I've mentioned, the work is underway to determine if that proposal or for short or long term or if there's another path forward. But the work is underway. As I said, we're committed to bringing the model forward to Truro. I'm waiting for the final details on what the proposed approach is best suited to get the service there in the short term as well as the long term for the northern region.
The honourable member for Inverness.
I was afraid I was going to be left standing in the lurch there for a second, but I have a question for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, I recently plugged my laptop into my desk here at the Legislature, and I can report we have incredible high-speed internet service. We have speed of up to almost 850 megabytes per second. But in rural Nova Scotia, many people are living with less than 1 megabyte per second. High-speed internet is as important today in a home as indoor plumbing. It's a basic requirement for most people in terms of where they live and being even able to work at home. The government has announced millions to improve internet service, and it would appear that the private industry in the province is content to let government fix the problem. Does the minister realize that his government's announcement of millions of dollars has effectively stalled any further improvements by the private sector for rural internet users?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do thank the member for the question, although I completely disagree with the premise of that. The term commonly used is market failure. The reality is that in some areas, some regions of the province, there's no business plan. It doesn't make any viable sense for a private sector operator to try to invest to get to these remote places. That's just the reality of it. So they look to government, they look to the people who they elect to put together a program that provides that and invest very important tax dollars to get that job done. And Mr. Speaker, at $193 million, we're setting the tone for the entire nation with respect to broadband and internet investment. Thanks.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hope the minister's not arguing that internet service providers are poor, because we know they're not. They're very profitable. And I can understand, but I think there has to be some acknowledgement by industry that they play a role in the economy. And, you know, sometimes business cases improve in areas of the province. And I can appreciate the government wants to get this right. A minister commented last week that a past government promised to deliver high speed for all, but did not achieve that. But the fact is, the companies that took that subsidy did have to connect anyone who came to them within that 5-year period. We know My question for the minister, what conversations has the minister had with industry? Do they remain committed to constant improvement of service and continued investment of their own to improve service in rural Nova Scotia? Because we are not seeing it throughout most of the province.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with respect to the promise to get internet access to all Nova Scotians a number of years back, what I said around that was that it was an impossible task, and I think that even the Premier of the day and the government of the day didn't appreciate the magnitude of that challenge. And that wasn't a criticism, that's just the reality of it. It's $500 million as we stand here. So it was something that you couldn't predict at that time, and I know they wanted to get there, but obviously that's something that we're still not even close to, but we're going to get us a whole lot closer. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the ISPs, look, we know who they are. We know who the players are. They're going to have a very important role here. I'm not going to throw them under the bus and make this that they're a part of this problem. They're going to be part of the solution. That includes private sector investment, so they're going to help us get there. Thanks.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My questions to the Minister of Lands and Forests. I received a letter from the Yarmouth County Mutual Aid Association, which I will table, but I'll find it here in my notes. The Mutual Aid Association has become concerned with the forest fire capacity, fire fighting capacity in Yarmouth County and surrounding areas. According to the letter, more and more volunteer firefighters being called out to fight forest fires. Now, this has been traditionally a responsibility of the province. My question to the Minister of Lands and Forests, could the Minister provide some detail on the current forest fighting capacity in Yarmouth County?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for the question. There has been no reductions in staff over the last number of years. We always move our resources around given where the activity and the forest fires are occurring. There is also no burn zones that we put up where, and I know the member's area applies to that. We also base our helicopters in strategic areas, so we continue to provide that service in that area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I do believe what the Mutual Aid Association is telling us, that they are putting more hours into forest fires than they have before. With the recent drought conditions, I can certainly understand why this summer might see an uptick in forest fires. The Mutual Aid Association claims that this has been ongoing for a few years now. Firefighters, volunteer firefighters, are primarily focused on residential fire protection, the occasional small brush or grass fire. And when the volunteers are called out to fight forest fires, resources end up being spread thin, and that creates vulnerabilities in fire coverage across the county. Will the minister commit to properly resourcing department firefighting capacity in the Yarmouth area so volunteer firefighters can focus on their residents?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank all the firefighters across the province who deliver outstanding service. Very impressed with all the work that they've been doing, and I want to actually remind the member that when we do need more resources, our sister provinces are there to help out as we help and reciprocate that service to them. I also want to table a chart here that shows that our service and our FTEs in the area and throughout southwest Nova Scotia has remained at the same level since 2016-17. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll table that.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Immigration. The Nova Scotia Express entry programs are meant to speed up the immigration process for applicants with specific employment qualifications. With our aging population, we are in need of people who work in caregiving occupations. Mr. Speaker, this year we have opened up new streams to fill gaps in other professions that have shown a clear need, like early childhood educators. Unfortunately, caregiving professions do not qualify for the express entry streams. My question is this, Mr. Speaker. Is there any action being taken to open express entry immigration streams to caregiving professions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I really want to thank my colleague for the very important question. It also gives me the opportunity to tell all members of the great work and success that we're having in the Nova Scotia Office of Immigration and all of our streams. First, I do want to thank the office, the staff, the Premier for making immigration a priority for the last number of years in this province. And I want to really express again my let Nova Scotians know of the great work we're doing in terms of our landings. It's the highest number that we have in this region. Our retention levels are the highest numbers that we have in the region, so is our population growth. And all that is leading to economic success in our express entry and in all of our 6 streams at the provincial nominee. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At a meeting earlier this year with Northwood Home Care, I learned they needed to hire 50 to 60 people immediately to fill the needs of their patients. Mr. Speaker, I have constituents who are certified in caregiving professions but are unable to work because of their immigration status and have been turned away from the express entry streams. Mr. Speaker, these individuals want to work to help fill the clear gaps in our system, but they face long wait times until they are able to work here. My question is this, Mr. Speaker, does the Minister have plans to use the Department of Immigration to fill the gaps in our caregiving professions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. We definitely do. So we have a number of streams. We have 6 streams. We've got 2 under the express entry, but I also want to remind you we have the skilled stream as well, which they can definitely use that. We also have the Atlantic Immigration Pilot, which has been working marvelously in the province over the last year and a half, which I invite them to contact us, and we will help steer them in the specific direction that they need to come to. It may not necessarily be express entry, it could be one of the other streams, and we're always there to assist them in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers with a little bit extra time there added on.